In today's video, I'm answering your New York City life questions as a New Yorker. Let's get right into it. Okay friends, this video might come as a bit of a random one because I actually haven't lived in New York City for about 3, almost 4 years now. I now live in New Jersey, which is just a neighboring state. But I most recently posted a New York City vlog video on the channel, and it was my first one ever. I don't know why. And I've been getting a lot of questions about New York City life because I mentioned in that video that I'm originally from New York. Like, I was born, raised, and I lived there for most of my life. So I figured that I would do one quick Q&A video where I talked about those questions that you have, answer them as best as I possibly can. And I'm going to go through 5 questions to be exact. So thank you in advance for the questions that you sent. These 5 questions, I realized as I was going through them that I can really get deep into them. So it might take some time. So I'm just going to jump right into it. And the first question I think is a really good question to start things off. That question is, where did you live in New York City or grow up in New York City, and what was that like? So I was born, raised, and lived in South Richmond Hill, which is a neighborhood in Queens, which is a borough of New York City, for, I would say, my entire childhood up until my young adult life. For context, if you want to know where that neighborhood is, think about JFK Airport in New York City. It's very close to there. And I know people are going to be like, oh my gosh, that's really far, especially in context of Manhattan and Brooklyn. And you're absolutely right. It is pretty far, but that is where I grew up. So once I got into my college years, I did move out from my mom's house and I moved to a neighborhood that is very close by to South Richmond Hill. I lived in Jamaica, Queens, another neighborhood in Queens. And I lived there for, I think, about 3 or 4 years. And then I moved to another neighborhood in Queens, which is called Kew Gardens, and I lived there for 3 years, and that was the last place that I lived in before I bought a house and moved to New Jersey. So all in all, I lived in Queens my entire life up until right now where I live in New Jersey, and I love Queens so much. I know it's not the borough that most people talk about. I know we love Manhattan, we love Brooklyn, but I will always have a special place in my heart for Queens, and I deliberately chose to live in Queens my entire life as a New Yorker because there are just so many great things about Queens. It's so diverse. Every neighborhood is so vast and different, and it's an amazing experience. And I will say that if you're thinking about Manhattan and Brooklyn and how very city urban it is, very close together and jam-packed with businesses and buildings and apartments and stuff like that, Queens is not that. At least it wasn't when I was growing up. It's very suburb. It's still very suburb in comparison to Manhattan and many parts of Brooklyn. There are houses, there are neighborhoods that are just like full of trees, and it's just a lot more spacious. I'm not saying that Brooklyn and Manhattan don't have those spaces, but Queens is just a lot more of that. It's a lot more spacious in comparison. But yeah, so that is where I grew up and lived my entire New York City life. And I will say, like, as a child, things were very chill. Things were very quiet. That's probably hard to believe thinking about New York City and all of the associations with New York City, but the 90s to early 2000s were a lot more chill, a lot more quiet, and a lot more spacious, especially in Queens nowadays. People are kind of branching out into Queens and moving into those areas, whereas before people only wanted to stay in Brooklyn and Manhattan. But now that people are kind of branching out and developing certain areas in Queens, it's getting really tightly packed. And so it just wasn't like that when I was a kid. Things were super chill. Things were super quiet. You never really heard noise. Again, that suburb kind of vibe, it felt very suburb vibe, at least as much as you possibly can living in one of the boroughs of New York City. So I really love that. I feel super nostalgic about that time. I really miss that time because when I do visit my mom every once in a while, it just doesn't feel the same. It just feels far more tightly packed. But anyway, that was what it was like growing up there as a kid. When I hit 11, 12 years old, like middle school age, the fast-pacedness of New York City hit me like a wall of bricks. It was immediate. Things were immediately fast paced. I was taking the bus, like the MTA, by myself. I was navigating life by myself for a lot of the time, which is really strange to say as an 11-year-old, but those are some of the things that you have to do as a New York City kid. And also as a kid with a parent that's very busy, you know, working a 9 to 5 in Manhattan, whereas we live in Queens, and like all of the doings that we had were being done in Queens, but my mom was like in Manhattan. So like you're navigating life kind of on your own for a lot of the time of the day, just, you know, figuring it out and taking mass transit as an 11-year-old. So it was fast paced, so fast, so suddenly. And I didn't really notice it at the time. I thought it was pretty exciting. Like once you start to get a little bit of independence, even if it's at such a young age, it's exciting and you get to explore in New York City, which is something that's we all want to do. Even as adults, we all want to do. So I didn't really notice how fast paced things were getting so quickly at that age. But now looking back at it, I realize things never stopped since then. They never stopped getting faster and faster since the age of 11, 12. But I will say Queens life in general, a lot more chill in comparison to Brooklyn and Manhattan. Like I mentioned, Queens has so many little mini neighborhoods that are so vastly different from one another, and they will be right smack next to each other. There is such an incredible array of food. I am telling you now to this day, and I will never back down on this statement, you will find the best food in New York City in Queens, not in Manhattan, not in Brooklyn, not even in the Bronx. In Queens, they have the most diverse food you can ever imagine, and it's packed with flavor. So that's just one thing in general to know about Queens. Okay, so the next question is New York City life in general. What is it like? So I briefly talked about what it was like growing up as a child, as like a really young child in New York City. But as I started to get older, and like I said, when things started to pick up the pace when I was 11 and 12, when I got into my teenage years, it was just exploration like no other. You probably know and have heard that New York City, there is always something to do. There's always, always, always something new happening, something to explore, something you've never visited before, even if you've lived here your entire life. And that's absolutely true, even to this day. Like, I still haven't explored every single inch and corner of New York City. So when I was in my teenage years, and like I said, I was growing independence and starting to, navigate life and do things kind of independently because my mom was like working and, things and such. I did a lot of exploring. I went to all areas that I could possibly go to. All of the touristy areas, I've explored them when I was like 13, 14 years old. All of the unknown gems, I've explored them when I was 15, 16 years old. And it just kept going. It was like every single day, every single week, there was something new to explore. There was something new to do. And having all of these friends that I grew up with, we would kind of band together and do all of these things. Now, did my mom know that I was doing all of these things? Absolutely not, but that is also part of the New York City life. You want to go out, you want to explore, you want to do the things that your parents are probably like, you shouldn't do that yet, you're too young, but you do it anyway because you kind of have this independence, this innate independence because your parents are at work, you have the free time, and so you go out, you explore, you have a student metro card, you do your thing. So there was a lot of that happening in my teenage years. I will say there was so much in my teenage years. I've done probably decades and decades of experiencing and living in my teenage years than in comparison to what I've probably done in my mid to late 20s, even like the entirety of my mid to late 20s. So a lot of experiencing, a lot of stuff. If you need any recommendations about New York City in general, I have more than likely experienced it, and I've experienced it for a really long time. It really is a lot of fun. It's fun like no other, and I get it when people who live in smaller towns or in suburb areas or kind of like more remote areas, they're like, I'm really missing out, and I absolutely get that, and it's kind of true because there's just so much. But also, I will say on the other end of that, it exposes you at a really young age to a lot of things that maybe you shouldn't. Like maybe our parents were right on that. Maybe we should have just stayed at home and played like silly kid games. But again, we want to experience and we have the independence and the time to do it, so we end up doing it anyway. And so I think through that, you build a hardened shell. And I think this is what a lot of people associate New Yorkers with being like tough and kind of mean and not really polite and stuff like that. But if you're a native New Yorker, you grow up in this kind of environment and you have to have a hardened shell. One, because you're experiencing a lot in a short period of time at a young age. And two, you really have to have your guard up. If you're doing those types of things at such a young age, you have to make sure that you're being safe and you're looking out for yourself. And there's just so much going on. There are a lot of dangerous things happening, but there's also a lot of sketchy people. It's not because New York City's a sketchy place necessarily. It's just because there's a lot of people in general. And so you just can't go about and be mindless because there's only a handful of people around the neighborhood, there's hundreds and hundreds of people constantly around you with their own motives and their own things. So you start to build a hardened shell, an experienced shell. You can be like 15, 16 years old and you've already lived decades and decades of life. And so that just naturally builds. And so when a lot of people say like, oh, you know, New Yorkers are really tough and they're really mean and impolite, but once you start talking to them, they open up and they're super nice. It's that shell. It's that being protective. It's that survival mode that we have. And as soon as people talk to us and they realize, you know, like that's just part of the survival of being a New Yorker, then you realize that we're just humans and we're trying to survive, and we are actually super nice, normal human beings underneath it all. So I think that all kind of factors in if you're ever curious about like, why are New Yorkers so like mean or uptight or kind of like, dude, get out of my way? It's, you know, we've experienced it like tenfold before you in that sense, if that makes sense. Okay, next question. New York City environment. What is it like? I'll just say it once more. It is fast, fast, fast. It's never slow. It's never, I can't recall a time in my life where New York City has moved at a slow pace, aside from that massive blackout when I was younger. Can't remember what year it was, but it was like a massive day-long blackout. That's probably the slowest I have ever seen New York City, ever. And it'll never go back to that ever again. I promise you that. But yeah, it's super fast. It's always on alert. You are always on alert. Going back to that point where I said we have a hardened shell. So everything is just fast paced. If you're looking for a slower paced, calmer life, New York City isn't exactly the ideal place for you. And that kind of, you know, lends into a question that I'll answer later about me moving to New Jersey and stuff like that. And obviously my channel is all about slow living. So yeah, it's extremely fast paced. You always have to be on alert. And in that sense, it kind of leans into you always have to be in survival mode when you're in New York City. Your brain is just wired to always be in survival mode. I mean, some people are more privileged than others, so they don't necessarily need to be in like high alert survival mode in comparison to others, but more or less there's always like a survival vibe. Okay, next question. How do you afford living in New York City? This is such a great question, and I'm sure a lot of people who ask this question are like, I want to move to New York City, or, you know, I've always thought about moving to New York City, but like it just seems so expensive. Unfortunately, I have no words of reassurance for you. New York City is expensive. It is like when people say that it's not expensive, when people try to like wiggle their way out of that question, I think they're straight up lying, or they have the money. They have money. New York City is expensive, and that's coming from someone who's lived there their entire life. It's expensive. But you just have to understand that everything costs money in New York City. You just have to understand that. So if you're willing to move to New York City, you want to have the experience, you just have to understand that everything is going to cost money, and some things are going to cost a lot of money. So you just have to have that understanding set up, and you have to be okay with that. You have to be comfortable with that if you are considering moving to New York City. The other thing is, whether you lived in New York City your entire life or you're just getting to situate yourself as a person who lives in New York City, you're gonna have to learn to be frugal, resourceful, and innovative with your money. So what I mean by that is, one, frugal. You aren't just going to be spending money on anything and everything, unless you have the money, unless you have like copious amounts of money. Sure, but we're not talking about that. But you do need to be frugal. You need to budget for sure. You need to be like on a really strict budget. If you're not being on a strict budget, you will quickly climb into debt in no time. And you have to be resourceful and innovative with your money. So what that can mean is, like, say you get an apartment, maybe you share an apartment, and that's being resourceful because you are splitting the rent in half with someone else. Or perhaps you get furniture that is multi-use. So say you don't have a desk space, you only have like a living room area. You're gonna have to get resourceful with how you situate the room and buy furniture with the room so that you can be on a budget and you can use furniture for multi-uses, if that makes sense. Things like that. Those are very simple examples that I can think of when we're talking about people who are just moving into New York City, but you can get resourceful in so many other ways in terms of like getting food, maybe like the takeout, the way that you're resourceful with like using it as meal prep or divvying it up as multiple meals, because food can get really expensive, especially takeout in New York City, things like that. You just have to be in the mindset of being innovative, frugal and resourceful with the way that you spend your dollars, because it can go a long way depending on where you look, depending on where you go. Another thing, like, you don't necessarily have to live in Brooklyn and Manhattan. I know people are not gonna like to hear that, but if you ventured out into Queens, you could probably save 40-50% on your rent costs, and then you just take a quick 20-minute commute, depending on where you are in Queens, into Manhattan and Brooklyn whenever you want to. So again, just being resourceful and innovative and thinking outside of the box in order to really stretch out your dollars. Okay, and then the last question, which ties this all back into slow living. So noticeable differences / pros and cons of New York City life versus New Jersey life. Now, I will say, I mentioned this at the top of the video, I have only lived in New Jersey for 3 coming on to 4 years, I think. I think it's about to be 4 years. And for some people, they would say 3 to 4 years is enough to be like, I'm from that area. I know a lot of people do that in New York, but for me, as someone who lived 26, 27 years in New York and nowhere else, I think I'm still a rookie. I'm still a newbie when it comes to New Jersey life, and I really don't know the scope of it. And I should just say, like, as a disclaimer, all of this is my experience with New York City, and it's not the whole scope of my New York City life. Again, 26 plus years in one state. I have so many other stories to tell, so if you have any other questions, let me know. But the same goes for New Jersey life. Like 3 to 4 years, I feel like I'm still brand new in the state. But I will say a couple of things that come top of mind. New Jersey is like a calmer version of New York City. They're very similar in a lot of ways, but they are very different in a lot of ways. And I think the differences are really pivotal for me and my slow living journey. So for example, the pace is a little bit slower. I've noticed immediately, like, a lot of people approach their jobs, a lot of people approach their life and the way that they go about their day in a much more calmer, slower pace in comparison to New York. You cannot get someone to stop on the road, or you cannot get somebody to like walk at a normal pace in New York City. That's just the way that it is there. Whereas here in New Jersey, people will have the time at the register to stop and be like, hey, how are you doing? Have a full-on conversation with you before ringing you up for your coffee. And it's just examples like that where there's a slight difference. I'm not saying like you can't have that experience in New York City, but it's more of the norm in New Jersey in comparison. I'm definitely not going to compare New Jersey to like a much more slower paced state that I know nothing about. But just comparing the two, the pace is a little bit slower in New Jersey. I'll also say New Jersey is more nature centric. When I talk about New Jersey to people, and most of the people in my life are from New York, they think of Jersey City, they think of Hoboken, which is pretty much like an extension of Manhattan, it's just over the water. But in reality, New Jersey is a really big state and there is a lot of nature. There is a lot of places that you can go and discover and explore. That's very, very nature centric. There's so many hiking trails. I live 10 minutes away from a hiking trail. There's a lot of nature, and I just want to remind people of that when we're talking about New Jersey. I will also say, when we're talking about the pace and things feeling rushed, New Jersey still has a quick pace, and I love that there has been a transition that I still feel comfortable in being a little bit faster paced over here, but it's much more sustainable over here. Again, the pace is slower, so it's more sustainable. It doesn't feel like I'm in fight or flight mode constantly, whereas I felt like that a lot in New York. So yeah, the pacing over here is far more sustainable, far more livable in my opinion. Also, everything doesn't necessarily cost something over here. As the days and the years and the months go on and I look at New York City, everything has a fee, everything has a cost. You have to pay for a parking space, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, that's just one example. But more or less, everything costs something in New York City, whereas that isn't necessarily the case in New Jersey. A parking space can just be a given in New Jersey, and that's just like a shell shock kind of thing for me as a native New Yorker. But yeah, I'm also not saying that like things don't also cost a lot of money and there aren't a lot of fees here in New Jersey. I feel like I'm doing a lot of disclaimers because people are going to be like, well, where I live in New Jersey, like this costs this and this is extremely expensive and blah, blah, blah. I'm just saying in comparison to my experience between New York City and New Jersey, where I live particularly, and the things that I do and the activities that I partake in. Okay, and then I've been kind of jumping back and forth between similarities and differences, but one similarity is that there's kind of a similar vibe / attitude Like I had mentioned before with New York, there's like a hardened shell, so people are kind of tough on the exterior, but once you start talking to them, they're really super nice and kind. The same goes here in New Jersey. People can really be minding their business, not so much as hard shelled as they are in New York City, but people will be minding their business and they'll be doing their thing, and they can be seen as aggressive here in New Jersey, especially if we're talking about driving and stuff. But once you start talking to someone, next thing you know, they're like your bestie, and I love that vibe, especially coupled with the slower pace, because I can actually have full-blown conversations with people and become like a companion to them or a friend to them. And I couldn't necessarily do that with just like somebody who is a barista at a coffee shop in New York City, if that makes sense. And in that same realm, community feels a little bit stronger over here in New Jersey because I'm able to slow down, have conversations with people, learn more about them. I've made so many connections and friendships with local businesses here in New Jersey. When I go into the shop, I can have a conversation with someone and catch up with them like as if I've known them for a while, whereas I wasn't able to do that as easily in New York City. And then of course, a big difference for me in my personal life, when I was a child, I grew up in a house. My mom has a house, but then like for the rest of my life in New York City, I lived in apartments, and that's obviously very small. My first apartment was hardly a one bedroom. It was so tiny. I literally grew out of that apartment. And then my second apartment, while it was still a one bedroom and it was bigger, it was still extremely tiny. It was so close to the neighbors that I can hear everything that they're doing. And so there's obviously a huge difference between apartment life and living now in a 2-bedroom house here with land in the front and the back and all of that stuff. So obviously that's a major difference for me. And then I think the last thing that I would just say, especially when it comes to slow living, is that over here I have the space, and this all ties everything in together. I have the space and the budget to pursue interests and personal joys, whereas I wasn't able to do that in New York because of survival mode and New York City culture. So what I mean by that is like over here I have the time, I have the space, I have the pace, I have the money, because like not everything costs $1 million over here. So I'm able to pursue things that are not just keeping myself alive, paying a mortgage, and all of the things that have to do with survival. I can do other things over here. And then the other part with the New York City culture thing is like when you're in New York City, most of the hobbies that you do are interconnected and ingrained in New York City culture. So it's like bar hopping or going to a particular area that's very trendy, or somebody talked about this bagel spot, so let's go to this bagel spot. And so like the things that you do, the hobbies that you partake in New York is mostly New York City culture based, as opposed to you based, personal joy based. And I'm not saying that you can't do that in New York City. I know that that's going to be my last disclaimer. I'm not saying that you can't do that, but it's far more acceptable and far more what you do in New York as your pastime, as opposed to what you do in New Jersey, where it's kind of like up to you. It's your choice. You can do whatever you want. You can even go back to New York City and indulge in the New York City culture, which I did a lot in 2024 on Sunday mornings. But I am going to end the video off here. I knew that those 5 questions were going to take a long time for me to get through, because there's so much in my brain that I can tell you about New York City, being a native New Yorker. And again, if you have any other questions for me about this, if you want to hear more about slow living and how you can pursue that in New York City, because I think you can do that, or the comparisons between New York City life, New Jersey life, slow living, and all of those things that kind of interconnect in this video, let me know in the comments section. But thank you once again for everybody who asked me questions and were very curious about this. I'm more than happy to share my experience. Thank you once again. I hope this was interesting, and I will talk to you in the next video.